So today's session I decided to entitle New Methods from Old. Basically, we're looking at ways in which you can use learning that you've done for a particular method to work out and to learn and to ring new methods. And that's the kind of the thing that we're looking at in this session. During the course of it, I've got a puzzle for you to think about, which should come up here. So first thing to emphasize, all the different examples I'm using, I'll use some examples from doubles methods, from surprise minor, from surprise major. That doesn't mean that you have to be ringing those methods at all. It's just that I'm using various different examples. So the principles from these different examples apply across to lots of different methods. So the fact that I've just put up two peel compositions of 23 spliced surprise major doesn't mean that I'm expecting us all to go and ring Chandler's surprise major, splice surprise major any minute once the towers are open again. It's just an example. Anyway, the little puzzle that I'd like you to think about during this session. These are two peel compositions, both 5,152 changes long, and both of 23 methods spliced together. So that means a different method each lead, as it were, where the treble's going up the back, coming back down to the front. And there are 23 methods and they're spliced together, and that's the most you can get in a normal peel length of surprise major. The first one was composed by Norman Smith in the 1960s, perhaps, and was kind of groundbreaking composition. Anyway, one of these compositions, the one on the left of the screen, the one that starts as Zeus, Bob, Biddenden, Johannesburg, Fordcombe, is, relatively speaking, significantly easier than the one on the right by Stephen Chandler. And the reason why the one on the left is significantly easier should become apparent during this training session. So if at the end I'm going to ask you to suggest in the chat box why the one on the left might be, relatively speaking, I'm not saying it's easy, but it'd be a lot easier to ring than the one on the right, hopefully out of the three things I'm going to talk about today, you might be able to work out why it is that the one on the left is the easier one. Don't worry if you can't, but we'll see. We'll discuss that at the end, and we'll see if we can work it out as a little puzzle for you to think about during the training session. So I thought we'd look at three different things, three different ways of getting, as I said in the title, new methods from old. All of the examples are illustrative, so don't worry if you're not ringing these things at the moment, but the principles apply to lots of different methods. The first kind of example I thought we'd talk about is doubles methods. And on the right of the screen, I've got plain bob doubles, where there's lots of plain hunting, and then when the treble's leading here, there's a dodge in 3/4 and some places made. On the left, I put a method that some of you might recognize as St. Simon's bob doubles, which is a fairly popular doubles method to ring. So sort of plain bob grancer, and then perhaps St. Simon's as the next step, perhaps. And what I thought we'd have a think about is how you can actually take this method and find lots of other possible methods out of it. So just to look at the blue line for a moment, we can see that we've got, for the second, rather than in bob doubles hunting up to the back, it leads and then does a double dodge on the front. Then it's coming up to 3/4, dodging 3/4, a bit like this bit of work in bob doubles here. And the basic principle of the method is you've got two bells on the front that are double dodging together, and you've got bells making thirds from the back and going back up. All of the time that bells are what we'd call above the treble, so higher in the change than the treble is, they're effectively ringing plain bob doubles. Hopefully we can see this bit of line here, where we're coming down to 3/4 down, is really similar, well, it's identical to this bit of line here. So whenever you're above the treble, and this will become an important thing in the next couple of bits that I'm going to talk about, whenever you're above the treble, you're ringing plain bob doubles. But below the treble, you've got this front work and thirds from the back. Now, one thing that people have done to try to get more methods out of this is to change the work that's happening on the front here. So this method is called St. Simon's. This method is called St. Martin's, and if we look at the two, they're identical in every aspect except for this bit of front work here and here. So there are two approaches to that. One would be to say, okay, so I just ring St. Simon's all the time, except when I'm on the front, when I do something different. And that's a kind of, while you're ringing it, slightly making it up as you go along approach of, right, we do this when we're on the front in St. Martin's, we do this when we're on the front in St. Simon's. Or you can just use it as a learning tool. So lots of these bits of line will be familiar or will be identical to St. Simon's. You could think, okay, so that reduces the amount of learning that I've got to do. So changing small areas of the work that happens is a way of getting new methods, and you can kind of carry on with this principle. So this is a method I think called St. Osmond with a different front work again, but all of the rest of the work is identical. So a sort of long lead, dodge and seconds thing. And this is a method called Amesbury with 4 blows on the front and then 3 blows in seconds. And so quite quickly out of that, we've suddenly taken one method, St. Simon's, and we've got 3 more methods, 3 additional methods, out of changing the work that's happening on the front. So making small changes to the line as a way of getting new methods. And as I said, you can either use this approach as a, okay, so while we're ringing it, just knowing this is the difference in the front work and just kind of executing that as you go, or as a learning tool in terms of reducing the amount of learning time that you'd spend on working out particular new methods. This has been really helpfully kind of put into a useful table that I thought we'd take a moment to have a look at. I'll send all these links around later, but this is from the Cambridge district, which incidentally have been doing lots of really good online talks, which you can look up on their YouTube channel. This table here is a bit kind of intimidating at first, but if we look at this column here, we can see those 4 methods that I was just talking about. So when you've got plain bob above the treble, we have St. Simon's with this front work, St. Martin's with this front work, St. Osmond with this different front work, and Amesbury with this front work. And those are the 4 methods that I was just showing you, and they're in the same column, as it were, because they're related by having the same work taking place above the treble. So the red line here is the treble, and all those other blue lines are the working bells ringing plain bob doubles when they're above the treble. Some of you might have rung a method called reverse Canterbury, which basically takes the work of bob doubles and puts these kind of Kent places in 3/4 in place of the dodging. And if you say, okay, so we're going to have reverse Canterbury above the treble and these different front works, you get another family of methods, so St. Nicholas, Winchenden, St. Remigius and Huntley. And hopefully we can see now how this is potentially really useful, because we've got to do this, learn to ring 10 methods, 10 different doubles methods, learn 2 works above the treble, plain bob and reverse Canterbury, and this one's plain hunting, 5 works below the treble, so the St. Simon's front work, St. Martin's, St. Osmond and Amesbury. And suddenly we can extend the method repertoire that we've got from basically 3 methods, reverse Canterbury, plain and St. Simon's, into 10 methods by adding these different changes to the front work. And suddenly we've got lots more methods. And you can then have other above works and get more methods and increasingly more methods. And this table, rather scarily, just keeps on going on and on and on over to the right with more and more and more methods. So I hope that's an interesting example of ways in which you can vary small aspects of the front work in this case in order to get lots of different methods. It's also quite useful for splicing, and I've got plans for a future talk about spliced and bringing different methods together and changing methods at the lead end, in that you can ring all 4 of these methods spliced together in one extent, a 120, and you can make it, it can be completely true without any repeated changes, as long as you have the same bells on the front work in the same method. So in St. Simon's, you ring St Simon's when, for example, 2 and 4 are together on the front, and you ring St Martin's when 3 and 5 are together on the front, and that sort of thing. And you can ring touches of spliced using these different front works. In the world of surprise major ringing, changing small aspects of the work is what's known as what's called a trivial variation, which makes it sound really easy and simple. It's not necessarily actually really easy and simple, but it's what's known as a trivial variation. This is Yorkshire Surprise Major, and actually on Composition Library they have a new feature where it lists all of the so-called trivial variations. There are actually 71, I had no idea about this, 71 methods which are basically the same as Yorkshire Major, but with little tweaks listed down here. Just to show an example, this one, Quidgley, is, and if you aren't sure about the line for Yorkshire, you'll have to take my word for it, is identical to Yorkshire, except that there's this little change here and here, but everything else, the bells are just ringing Yorkshire Surprise Major. So that's the kind of applies across to other stages as well, where you have this idea of changing a small section of the line in order to get, as it were, new methods. Okay, pop back to here. Right, so that's a kind of idea of making small changes to get new methods from old, as it were, in that if you can ring St Simon's, actually it wouldn't be that hard if you can ring St Simon's to then take that learning and use it to ring St Martin's, St Osmond and Amesbury. And then you can look at that table and find all sorts of other fun and interesting doubles methods to try at your practice night when they resume, or at your ringing room practice if you're using ringing room for practices at all. The next sort of technique I thought we'd look at is doing something different at, I suppose it's similar in a way, doing something different at one row of the method, and that's either at what we'd call the lead end or the half lead. I'll just take a moment to explain what those things are. So in most methods, we have the treble, shown by this red line here, ringing a fixed path. So in playing Bob, for example, it hunts up to the back of the change and then back down to the front and leads. When the treble leads, and in this method, in Cambridge Surprise Minor, it's dodging in each place that it's in. When the treble leads, we call that the lead end, and here at backstroke is kind of the lead end here. And the half lead is where we're halfway through that whole lead of the method, and that's in this change here basically. So when the treble is at the back, when it's lying behind. So the lead end is where the treble's leading, and the half lead is where it's at the back. And what you can do, and this is particularly common with surprise minor ringing, is make small changes to what's happening at the lead end and at the half lead. The first example I'll give of that is taking Cambridge Surprise Minor, so this very popular surprise minor method, and just changing what happens here at the lead end. If we do that and we say, okay, so instead of a bell making seconds at the lead end, we're going to have a bell lying behind making sixths. Then we get a new method called Primrose Surprise Minor. And if we look at the blue line, we'll see, particularly here for thirds place bell, I'll just go back to Cambridge in a moment. If we look at what's happening here with thirds place bell, this sort of long back work and down, it's identical to thirds place bell in Cambridge, with one tiny difference here. Rather than dodging 3/4 down at the end of it to become fourths place bell, it hunts straight into seconds place. And so Primrose is exactly the same as Cambridge, except that when the treble leads, the bells plain hunt instead of dodging. So you've got a bell lying behind, and then these bells here and here are crossing rather than a bell making seconds and dodging in 3, 4 and 5, 6 happening. If we look at this visual representation of the method here, the grid, which has all of the lines for all of the bells shown on it, we'll see that they're absolutely identical. Just to prove this point, they're absolutely identical as methods, except for just here. Here's Primrose. They're exactly the same. Exactly the same things happening. The place notation's the same. If you've been at my talk about how methods work, we talked a bit about place notation, except that you've got that different lead end. So suddenly you've got two methods in the place of one. You can ring, if you can ring Cambridge, you can ring Primrose, and you can either do that by learning the line, and that'll be a lot easier than learning a completely new method, because if you know Cambridge, then so much of this will be really familiar, except for these bits here. Or you can do it entirely by saying, okay, I'm going to ring Cambridge, but when I hear the treble is leading or see the treble is leading, I'm going to plain hunt across the lead end rather than doing a dodge. And that's certainly a lot harder. And some of the, I think this kind of talk, there are two types of technique here. One is in terms of learning, so using this as a learning tool and thinking, okay, so my learning for Primrose is going to be a lot easier than my learning for Cambridge, because I've got to sort of just learn the subtle differences in the method. Or as a ringing technique, which is harder, but saying, okay, so I can ring Primrose because I can ring Cambridge, and I know that all I need to do differently is hunt at the lead end rather than do a dodge. And when you see, if you see sort of peals or quarter peals of lots of surprise minor or treble dodging minor methods, often what the ringers are doing is they are using that technique where they're learning one method, but out of it maybe getting, well, up to 4 different methods by making changes at the half lead and at the lead end, and just listening out for where the treble is and kind of executing it as they go, rather than learning 4 unique, distinct methods. If we change the half lead in Cambridge and take, rather than having a bell making fifths, have a bell leading, then we get another method. We get a method called Ipswich, and again we'll see it looks quite a bit different to Cambridge actually, because this change seems to make a bit more of a difference to the line. But basically we've got all the same ingredients here. That's the start of third place bell, but at the half lead, rather than making fifths and then dodging with the treble, third place bell comes down, and you sort of as it were take up the work that the bell that's in the place you would have been in would do in Cambridge. I've not explained that very well, but if you look at the line for fourth place bell, you'd see that fourth place bell ends up here at the half lead in Cambridge, and then comes down to do dodge and lead and 5, 6 up. So by hunting, the 3 sort of takes up that work rather than carrying on with the work it would have done, which would be this bit here. And so from that, because you can then also change what happens at the lead end in Ipswich and have hunting there as well, you can get a 4th method called Norfolk. And I've put this in a little table here on the right just to illustrate this. So we have Cambridge, which has seconds made when the treble's leading, so at the lead end, and fifths made when the treble's at the back, the half lead. Primrose has hunting at the lead end, but is the same as Cambridge in every other way. Ipswich has seconds at the lead end, but hunting at the half lead, as we can see here. And then Norfolk is kind of a combination of these 2 variations to Cambridge. So we've got hunting at the lead end as well as at the half lead. And this idea of thinking about it in terms of tables that describe the work is something that's going to come up in a moment in the next bit that we're going to look at. Okay. So I think this has kind of come up quite a bit already. I was talking about the idea of working, what happens above and below the treble when I was talking about doubles methods. So we talked about plain bob and reverse Canterbury doubles being 2 different works that can happen when bells are above the treble. And then St Simon's, St Martin's, St Osmond and Amesbury, those front works were the different types of work that could be happening below the treble. Just to show what I mean by that, obviously, as I've said, this red line shows the treble, and it's doing this regular work in each lead of the method. And if we can see here, the 2 in all of this section here of Yorkshire surprise major is below the treble, and the 2 here in this section of Cambridge is below the treble. When it's above the treble, so higher in the change than the treble is, here, just here, we can hopefully see that this is identical to this work here in Cambridge. And both Yorkshire and Cambridge surprise major are what's known as Cambridge above, which means that whenever bells are higher in the change than the treble is, they're ringing the same method, exactly the same line. So thirds place bell here and here is a good example of that. And Ipswich and Cambridge are both Cambridge minor, are both Cambridge above. You know, the bells above the treble that are higher than the treble in the change are doing the same work. And that applies in doubles, as we saw with plain bob St Simons and so on, are all plain bob doubles above the treble. And as I've sort of said a couple of times now, I think, you can use this as a learning technique. So to reduce your learning, if you say, learned Cambridge surprise major, and we're looking to then learn Yorkshire or vice versa, you can reduce the learning time by saying, okay, so I know that thirds place bell is identical in both methods, and I know that there are these common elements that will make it a bit easier to learn these 2 methods. And I just really need to focus on learning the different work that happens below the treble. Or it can be used as a ringing tool, or can be used as a ringing tool, so that when you're ringing certain methods and you're above the treble, you're sort of ringing something familiar like Cambridge, and then you might be ringing and focusing on the unfamiliar things when you're below the treble. How do you know when you're above or below the treble is an interesting thing to think about here. Partly it can be through listening, so hearing where the treble is in the change, but that's really hard. And I think we showed when we did our listening courses that that's a really tricky thing to do, actually. And partly it can be seeing where you pass the treble, and that's something that is emphasized a lot, I think, in the teaching of plain bob doubles. So people will often say things like, on your way up, if you pass the treble in 2-3, then you dodge 3-4 up, or if you pass the treble in 3-4, you go up to long fifths. That sort of thing is often talked about a lot in the early stages of method ringing in plain bob doubles, but doesn't come up so much and isn't emphasized as much, I don't think, in ringing surprise minor, surprise major until you get to quite an advanced level. So I think it's a really useful technique to look at. For example, here we're passing the treble in 4-5, so meeting it in fifths place at hand, treble's in fourths place, and going to fourths place and the treble comes up. That's where you would notice, perhaps, that rather than being above the treble, you've now gone to being below the treble. So looking out for where you're passing the treble is useful in terms of learning methods and in terms of ringing them as well. And so this idea of using above and below works is something that becomes really helpful and really sort of facilitates the ringing of complicated things, particularly in surprise minor and treble dodging minor, as we'll see in a moment. I thought to illustrate that, I'd put up another surprise minor method. It's a method called York. And York is effectively, it's taking 2 methods and combining them, smushing them together by having one method below the treble and a different method above the treble. If you're looking at the line, you might be perhaps noticing or starting to notice some familiar work around here that might remind you a bit of Cambridge minor. And what York is it's a method which has Cambridge minor above the treble. So all the time you're above the treble, you're ringing Cambridge, and that's either as a learning tool or a ringing tool or both. And it has London surprise minor below the treble. To show this visually, I put up the 3 grids for these methods. So York is here on the left, we've got London in the middle, and Cambridge on the right. If you just look at this section here, above the treble, where we've got bells working while the treble's making its way up to the back. And then look at this section of Cambridge here on the right, can hopefully see that those are identical, they're the same. third place bell York starts in exactly the same way as third place bell Cambridge. Also, if you are interested in things like place notation, you'll notice that the place notation is the same for these two methods up to here. And we talked a bit about place notation in the How Methods Work talk a couple of weeks ago. Then, if we look at all of this work under here, below the treble, and we can see sort of thirds being made here and down, fourths and down, fourths and up, that sort of thing. And then look at this section of the grid here, we can see that York is London below the treble. This is identical. And again, the place notation for this last section here, where the treble's towards the back, is the same as the place notation in London. So ringers who do a lot of surprise minor ringing and are ringing, say, York surprise minor, could be doing it in two ways. They could have significantly reduced the time they'd spend learning the line by saying, okay, so I know this bit of line already, actually, from ringing London, and I know this bit of line. I just need to make sure that I put those two bits of line together so that I know the whole line for York, and they'd spend time learning how to fit those two bits of the line together. Or perhaps as an accompaniment to this, they would be ringing London when they know they're below the treble, and ringing Cambridge when they know they're above the treble. So a good example of that is here, fifth place bell, where we start by lying behind and doing a double dodge, and then coming down to fourths. And at that point in London, the bell that's past the treble in 4/5, so thinking about passing the treble again, that's past the treble in 4/5, makes fourths, goes down to lead, and then comes up to make thirds. And so this little section of line, it's kind of like switching into and out of different methods, and that's really hard. And it's a technique that's used by really advanced ringers ringing very complicated stuff. But I think it's something that actually we can all have a go at and all try applying to our own ringing, whether it's ringing St. Simon's and St. Martin's and thinking, okay, so I've passed the treble in 2/3, going down, I'm going to start doing my front work, and that's the St. Simon's or the St. Martin's front work, whichever method you're ringing, or whether it's ringing surprise minor, surprise major. I showed you earlier the table of doubles methods. So this table here. There's a similar table for surprise minor. This is kept on the ringing.info change ringing resources website. Little shout out for ringing.info, which is an excellent website set up originally by Roger Bailey and now run by Peter Blight, who I think is on this talk at the moment. This is, what's described as possibly the most useful surprise minor table, 41 surprise minor table ever. Let's just unpick this a little bit, because at first, a bit like the doubles table, it's perhaps a little bit intimidating. If we just look over here, in this green section here, we've got Cambridge, Primrose, Norfolk, and Ipswich. We actually have that little table that I showed you earlier. So with the four methods that are effectively Cambridge, but with changes to what's happening at the lead end and at the half lead. So that little table is just here in this section called Cambridge above, where the bells that are above the treble are ringing Cambridge. Okay, and in this column of the table, we've got the methods where seconds is made when the treble is leading. So the lead end, seconds is made. So methods like Cambridge. And in this column of the table here, we've got methods where sixths is made when the treble's leading and the bells hunt across the lead end, and Primrose is that example I showed you earlier. And so we have lots and lots in this table, lots and lots of related methods. Born is the seconds place method, and Hull is the sixth place version at the lead end, sixth place version of that method. So they're effectively identical. You get two methods for the price of one if we can sort of just change what happens at the lead end. Yep. Our friend York that we were looking at earlier is just here in the table, and this leads on to the next point. We've got it in the Cambridge green section here, Cambridge above, in the seconds place column, because seconds is made at the lead end. but it's also in a row, and that row is this one here, London below. Here's London. And so all of these methods are related to each other by having London surprise minor rung when bells are below the treble. And all of these methods here are related to each other by having Cambridge rung when bells are above the treble. And so we're not just talking here about getting kind of two methods for the price of one, Cambridge and Primrose. We're actually talking about being able to get 41 methods for the price of about 8 methods, depending on how you kind of approach the learning of this. There are 4 different above works in the standard 41 surprise minor, popular thing to ring on 6. And there are all these different below works, but they're very closely related to each other. London below here, Norwich below, but with a couple of changes at the half lead, a big block of Cambridge below methods as well. So if we can get the kind of hang of partly the differences at the lead end and at the half lead, and partly this idea of above and below works, suddenly we can find that while there's a lot of learning involved in ringing something like this and ringing some of these methods, actually it's not perhaps as much learning as it might originally seem, I guess would be the kind of message I'd say to take from that. So we have these blocks of related methods, so 12 methods that are Cambridge above, that are in the standard 41, 6 that are London above. And they're related to each other by having the same work above the treble or the same work below the treble, big block of methods here. That also applies to like even more methods. Here's a really scary version of that table, which is for 147 methods. And again, you know, not many people have rung all these 147 methods, but it's actually lots of them are taking chunks of other methods and combining them as a way of moving between different methods. Okay, let's go back to that challenge, that puzzle. I asked what might make the composition on the left easier than the one on the right. Would anyone like to suggest via the chat box what it might be? And I'll give you a clue. It's 2 of the 3 things that we've talked about that might make the thing on the left easier than the method on the composition on the right. Any suggestions in the chat box, please? If we're not sure, that's fine. I will give you another moment to think about it. It's to do with the above work, and it's to do with this trivial variation thing. Okay, so this one on the left, all of the methods are Cambridge when bells are above the treble. So already that's sort of half of it massively reduces the learning. They're all Cambridge above the treble. And they're all of the methods are what we call trivial variations. So here's Quedgeley that I mentioned earlier as being closely related to Yorkshire. Basically, all of these 23 methods are versions of, variations of Rutland, Cambridge, Lincolnshire, and Yorkshire. So there's 4 methods, and it can be expanded into 23. The composer actually described it as a joke composition, and not a particularly serious one. Whereas the one on the right doesn't have many different above and many similar above and below works. They're almost all unique. There are a few that are the same. So Richmond is London above, and Caterham's Glasgow above, and Essex is Bristol above. But all of the others, they've got different and unique above and below works, which makes the one on the right a lot harder than the one on the left. They're both still hard. They're both tricky, but hopefully from what we've talked about and what I've talked about this morning, that gives perhaps an idea of how things that look really complicated on paper and are complicated, like 41 surprise minor, like lots and quarter peals with lots of doubles methods, actually aren't as complicated as they might at first look. They're still hard, but they're not perhaps as hard as perhaps as we might think. Okay,